Chapter 1: Echoes of Density. The rain in Viridium 7 was a greasy, metallic affair, laced with the residue of molten steel and pulverized ore. It hammered against the corrugated iron roofs of the lower scrap slums, a relentless percussion against the already grinding monotony of Arthur Vance's existence. He adjusted the worn straps of his hauling harness, the damp metal biting into his skin, and took another laborious step, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was, by all outward appearances, a picture of utter degradation. At 6 feet 4 inches, with a frame honed by years of brutal training he actively tried to suppress, he looked like a lumbering ox trying to navigate a maze. The perpetually smeared grime coating his face, the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, and the clumsy, almost apologetic way he moved all contributed to the impression of a simple, utterly unremarkable laborer. It was a deliberate, painstakingly constructed illusion. Arthur Vance was heir to the Vance Astra Group, a name synonymous with orbital dominance. His family controlled the production of G-cores, the incredibly complex gravity stabilizers that kept the opulent floating cities of the upper strata suspended in the void, and the massive mining rigs scraping precious minerals from the ocean floor. He was, in short, a god amongst industrialists, and the architect of a technology that shaped the very architecture of civilization. He was also, secretly, a density pulse master, a wielder of the legendary martial art that allowed the manipulation of gravitational mass, a power he had deliberately buried, a weapon he had vowed never to use. This particular sabbatical, this charade of a scrap hauler, was born of weary disgust. The opulent, weightless existence of the orbital elite, the endless gala dinners and vapid conversations about fluctuating market values, had grown suffocating. Had felt a profound disconnect, a sickening realization that his family's legacy was built on exploiting the very people who toiled to maintain its grandeur. So, had traded his genetically tailored pressure suit for this rough-spun harness, his private yacht for the grime-choked waterways of Viridium 7, and his family's sprawling estate for a job hauling blasted steel beams to the melting vats of the Foundry Collective. His workstation was a brutal, compact space wedged between a roaring furnace and a conveyor belt laden with mangled metal. The air thrummed with the heat, thick with the scent of burning iron and ozone. Overseeing him, with a perpetual sneer and a hand permanently gripping the barrel of his pulse pistol, was Warden Kraven, head of security for the Foundry Collective. Kraven was a granite-faced brute, the embodiment of corporate brutality, and he clearly took a perverse delight in Arthur's discomfort. "Vance!" Kraven's voice boomed across the workshop, punctuated by the clang of falling metal. "You move like a newborn groveling worm. Try to show some dignity, boy. Remember, you're dragging the future, not wishing for it." Arthur grunted in response, meticulously shifting a particularly heavy beam, a jagged shard of chroma steel, salvaged from a decommissioned warship, onto his shoulder. The artificial gravity grid, dialed to a brutal Threx planetary standard, pressed down on him with relentless force. It wasn't a comfortable sensation. It was a constant, draining reminder of his purpose. But it was also a crucial element in his training. The higher the gravity, the more efficiently his density pulse would function. "Malik!" Kraven bellowed, his voice dripping with disdain. "See how he strains? I wager he wouldn't last a minute on 3 times normal gravity. You're wasting your time, boy. You'll be crushed by the weight of the world before you finish your shift." Malik, Kraven's son, was a sneering, aggressively entitled teenager, notorious for his sadistic games. He was currently testing Arthur's endurance, casually raising the local gravity grid to 3 times its usual setting with a flick of a control panel. Arthur could feel the pressure building in his chest, a burning sensation spreading through his limbs. He focused, channeling his energy, subtly manipulating the gravitational field around his body, attempting to mitigate the effects. The effort was exhausting, a constant, silent battle against the overwhelming force. Bent spine, Vance, Malik jeered, his voice echoing with cruel amusement. You're a disgrace to manual labor. Those who drag the scrap are destined to be crushed by the weight of the world. He then proceeded to order Arthur to carry his heavily modified, battery-depleted hoverbike across the muddy courtyard, a task that added another layer of physical torment to Arthur's already grueling day. Just as Arthur was beginning to consider feigning a debilitating injury, a small, steady voice cut through the din. Need a hand, Vance? It was Naomi, a young mechanic who operated a workshop tucked away in the shadow of the Foundry Collective. She was a whirlwind of focused energy, meticulously piecing together broken exoskeletons for the crippled miners who labored in the depths of the mines. She was a splash of vibrant color in this monochromatic world of iron and soot. She knelt beside him, examining the chromasteel beam. You're fighting the gravity, Vance, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Let it flow with you. You move with such precision, despite the surge. It's like you're dancing with the weight. She offered him a small, carefully rationed cup of water, her hand brushing against his as she did so. He accepted it gratefully, the cool liquid a momentary reprieve from the oppressive heat and strain. As he drank, he realized, with a sudden unsettling clarity, that Naomi didn't see a clumsy laborer. She saw something else entirely, a mastery of balance, a profound understanding of weight and force, a subtle defiance of the very system that sought to grind him to dust. Chapter 2. Echoes of Singularity. The clang of the Foundry's rhythmic pulse settled into a dull thrum as Arthur continued his work, hauling the monstrous chromasteel beam. The artificial gravity, set at a particularly brutal Threx planetary, pressed down with an insistent, almost mocking weight. He moved with a controlled efficiency, his muscles screaming in protest, a grim ballet of sweat and strained effort. But Naomi's words, "You're fighting the gravity, Vance," echoed in his mind, a persistent, strangely soothing counterpoint to the physical agony. He began to experiment, subtly altering his movements, consciously trying to embrace the flow Shed described. It wasn't an instantaneous mastery. The beam remained stubbornly resistant, its weight still threatening to buckle his knees. But he noticed something. The tremors in his body lessened. The sharp, stabbing pain in his back subsided, replaced by a dull ache, almost comforting. Malik, predictably, seized the opportunity for further humiliation. "Look at Vance!" he bellowed, flanked by two hulking enforcers, their faces masked with expressions of brutal amusement. "Still straining like a rusted cog. You'll break a bone before you haul a single ton. Those who drag the scrap are destined to be crushed by the weight of the world." He deliberately increased the gravity grid by another 50, forcing Arthur into a near impossible state of control. Arthur's face was slick with sweat, his breaths ragged, but he maintained his balance, his movements refined, almost elegant. "You're learning, Vance," Naomi said quietly, observing from her workbench. "It's not about brute force. It's about cognition, about understanding the underlying principles." Suddenly, a new sound cut through the foundries, din the high-pitched whine of approaching drones. A squadron of Vance Astra security units, sleek and menacing in their obsidian armor, descended into the courtyard. Leading them was Warden Kraven himself, radiating an aura of cold, calculated authority. "Vance," Kraven's voice was a grating rasp, amplified by a vocal modulator. "I've been observing your progress. Your attempts to appear unremarkable are commendable, but ultimately futile. The Vance Astra Group does not tolerate inefficiency, nor does it tolerate weakness." Malik, eager to demonstrate his perceived superiority, activated the gravity grid around Arthur's workstation to its maximum setting, a staggering 4.5x planetary. The effect was immediate and devastating. Arthur doubled over, the air whistling from his lungs as the immense pressure threatened to crush him. He fought instinctively, channeling what felt like an internal current, and the beam, for a brief, almost unbearable moment, lifted a foot off the ground before crashing back down. "Impressive," Kraven said, a flicker of genuine interest in his eyes, but hardly conclusive. "Malik, demonstrate the Vance method." Malik, with a cruel grin, ordered one of his enforcers to heave a reinforced steel crate nearly a ton onto Arthur's back. The crate groaned under the strain, and Arthur strained with every fiber of his being, his face contorted in agony. But this time, something was different. The strain wasn't just physical, it was resonant. He felt a strange connection to the crate, a subtle shift in its weight, a way to anticipate its resistance. As he struggled to maintain his balance, he noticed, with a jarring clarity, that the gravity grid around him seemed torse-bound. It lessened, just enough to ease the pressure, just enough to allow him a crucial breath. "Interesting," Kraven murmured, his gaze fixed on Arthur with a predatory intensity. "It appears our scrap hauler possesses a hidden aptitude." As he spoke, Naomi noticed something unsettling. The air around Arthur shimmered briefly, distorting the light. The rhythmic clang of the foundry seemed to momentarily cease. She instinctively reached out, her hand brushing against his arm, a flicker of genuine concern in her eyes. Then, it happened. Without warning, a wave of power erupted from Arthur. The localized gravity grid around him imploded, collapsing in on itself with a silent, almost surgical precision. The steel crate, previously impossibly heavy, lifted effortlessly from his back, hovering in mid-air. The enforcers, caught completely off guard, stumbled back in stunned silence. Malik, his face a mask of rage and disbelief, let out a guttural shout. But Arthur didn't react with triumph. He simply stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes glazed over with a profound, unsettling calm. He was surrounded by a faint, almost invisible aura, a shimmering distortion of the air that hinted at the immense power he possessed. It was a brief, terrifying glimpse of the singularity state, an echo of the devastating potential contained within him. The aura vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the lingering scent of ozone and a palpable sense of dread. Kraven, recovering his composure, barked orders, quickly regaining control of the situation. But in that brief, terrifying moment, something had shifted. Arthur Vance was no longer simply a clumsy scrap hauler. He was a force of nature, a secret waiting to be unleashed. And Naomi, watching him with growing apprehension and a burgeoning sense of awe, knew that her simple act of kindness had inadvertently revealed a truth far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Chapter 3: Echoes of the Singularity. The aftermath of the gala of the High Corps settled over the Foundry City like a thick, oily smog. Officially, the salvage operation was proceeding with grim efficiency. The remaining enforcers, shaken by the display of impossible power, diligently cleared the debris-twisted metal, pulverized concrete, and the lingering sickly sweet scent of ozone. But the real work, the subtle, insidious shift in the atmosphere, was happening around Arthur Vance. Kraven, a man built on years of intimidation and control, was a study in simmering rage. He stalked around the ruined courtyard, his eyes constantly flickering towards Arthur, who was now meticulously sorting through the recovered shards of a communications relay. He hadn't spoken a word, hadn't even acknowledged Kraven's presence, furthering the unsettling feeling that Arthur was utterly detached from the chaos surrounding him. Malik, however, was a different beast. The humiliation of being pinned under a gravity-enhanced corpse had shattered his arrogance. He moved with a frantic, almost desperate energy, obsessed with understanding what had happened, how Arthur had performed that impossible feat. He began a relentless and increasingly unsettling interrogation of the remaining enforcers, demanding accounts of everything Head done, everything Head said to Arthur. Did he look at me?" he hissed, his face flushed with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Did he know? Meanwhile, Naomi was a whirlwind of quiet efficiency, meticulously inspecting the salvaged components. But her focus was fractured, her movements hesitant. The brief glimpse of Arthur's power had left a deep, unsettling mark. She kept glancing at him, a strange mix of apprehension and fascination in her eyes. The normally precise movements of her hands were now marred by a slight tremor. "Is different," she finally murmured to herself, examining a fractured gyroscope. "More complete." Arthur, oblivious to the mounting tension, continued his task, his movements strangely fluid and deliberate. He was unconsciously manipulating the localized gravity field around a particularly large piece of steel, carefully guiding it towards a crushing vat, with a subtle flick of his wrist. The technicians, accustomed to his awkwardness, simply attributed it to his unique method of handling heavy loads. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air, a resonance that vibrated through the very steel of the foundry. Kraven froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the pressure regulator on his wrist, a device that amplified his own limited control over the local gravity grid. "He's building it," he growled, his voice strained. "He's preparing." And he was. Arthur wasn't consciously attempting anything dramatic, but the air around him shimmered again, the faint, almost invisible aura returning. This time, it was more defined, more potent. The debris field around him began to subtly shift, rotating with an increased velocity, not driven by any external force, but by a precisely modulated gravitational field emanating from Arthur. He was practicing, mastering the singularity state. This time, Naomi didn't observe from a distance. Drawn by an inexplicable compulsion, she cautiously approached him. "Arthur," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing?" Arthur didn't turn. He continued to manipulate the debris, a serene expression on his face. "I am learning," he replied, his voice surprisingly calm and measured. "This power, it responds to intention, to focus." As he spoke, the aura intensified. The rotating debris field became a vortex, swirling with terrifying speed. Suddenly, a small iron wrench, one he had been painstakingly sorting, shot out from the center of the vortex with tremendous force, slamming into the wall with a deafening clang. Kraven reacted instantly. He activated his regulator, attempting to disrupt Arthur's control, to overload the local gravity field. But his efforts were futile. Arthur's manipulation was far too precise, too instinctively powerful. Kraven's regulator sputtered and died, and the vortex collapsed with a silent ripple. "You cannot control it," Arthur said, his eyes now burning with an unsettling intensity. "You can only be controlled by it." He looked at Naomi, a flicker of understanding passing across his features. "The density," he said, almost to himself. "It's not just about weight. It's about shape." He reached out, and with a single, deliberate movement, subtly altered the shape of a discarded metal plate, bending it into a perfect, miniature replica of a falcon. The effect was breathtaking. Naomi stared at the tiny, gravity-defying falcon, her mind reeling. You are manipulating space-time itself," she breathed, the implications of his power sinking in with terrifying force. As if responding to her words, the aura flared one last time, brighter and more intense than before. This time, it wasn't just a glimpse of the singularity state. It was a full, unadulterated expression of its terrifying potential. The ground beneath their feet trembled. The foundry city held its breath. And Arthur Vance, the clumsy scrap hauler, finally stepped out of the shadows, not as a man trying to conceal his power, but as its sovereign. Chapter 4. Echoes of the void. The silence after the second manifestation of the singularity state was thicker than the ferrous dust that perpetually clung to the floor. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of expectation, of the mundane reality they'd both known just moments before. The foundry city, a labyrinth of gears and steam, felt fundamentally altered. as if a profound, unsettling truth had been etched into its very architecture. Malik, bruised and humiliated, still lay pinned beneath the weight of a dozen fallen enforcers, his face a mask of bewildered rage. He attempted to thrash, to break free, but the localized gravity field, now calibrated with frightening precision, held him utterly immobile, a grotesque puppet in Arthur's silent command. Kraven, stripped of his regulator and his arrogance, stood frozen, his expression a mixture of fear and grudging respect. Arthur, however, remained motionless, his hands still resting lightly on the ground. The aura around him had faded, leaving behind a residual shimmer in the air, a silent testament to the immensity of what had unleashed. He looked at Naomi, truly looked at her, not with the detached curiosity of an observer, but with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "It's not about brute force," Arthur said, his voice now resonant and uncharacteristically calm. "It's about resonance. Every object, every space, vibrates with a unique gravitational signature. I'm learning to perceive, to manipulate those signatures." He gently picked up the miniature falcon, rotating it slowly in his hand. "Think of a bell. You strike it once, and it produces a single note. Strike it again, and it produces a different note. Similarly, altering the density, the shape, of something. It changes its vibrational frequency, its inherent gravitational presence." Naomi, a pragmatic mechanic accustomed to diagnosing and repairing complex machinery, struggled to grasp the sheer scale of his abilities. "You're saying you can change the way things exist?" "Not change exactly," Arthur corrected, "but influence, guide. I'm not creating gravity, I'm directing it. Like a sculptor working with clay, I shape the gravitational field to achieve a desired effect." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage, the shattered kinetic hammer, the crushed enforcers, the hovering scrap. "The foundry isn't just a collection of metal and machinery. It's a symphony of gravitational forces, and I can conduct it." Suddenly, the foundry's internal mechanisms began to shift. The rhythmic clang of the smelting vats stuttered, then slowed, then ceased entirely. Steam hissed from the pipes, momentarily freezing mid-flight before collapsing into dense, shimmering clouds. The artificial gravity grids, normally unwavering, pulsed erratically, threatening to destabilize the entire district. Kraven, recovering his wits, yelled, "Stop it! You're disrupting the entire system." Arthur didn't respond. Instead, he focused his attention on the largest, most unstable gravity grid, the one that powered the foundry's primary smelting vat. With a deliberate gesture, he reached out and touched the metal casing, his fingers tracing the complex network of conduits. The sputtering subsided. The erratic pulses smoothed out. The vat, moments away from catastrophic overload, settled into a steady, controlled rhythm. "The grids aren't designed to withstand interference," Arthur observed, his voice gaining an edge. "They're built on a fundamental misunderstanding of gravity itself." This revelation, this demonstration of absolute control, sent a ripple of fear through the assembled enforcers. They had expected a brutal display of power, a terrifying demonstration of overwhelming force. Instead, they witnessed a surgeon dismantling a broken machine, a conductor restoring a chaotic melody. As the foundry slowly stabilized, a low hum filled the air, the unmistakable sound of a corporate vessel descending. A squadron of gold-plated dreadnoughts bearing the Vance Astra crest emerged from the swirling clouds, casting a monumental shadow over the foundry city. Grand Director Silas Vance, Arthur's father, stepped ashore, radiating an aura of cautious admiration. He knelt, not in supplication, but in a gesture of acknowledgement, recognition of his son's extraordinary power. "Arthur," Silas said, his voice amplified by a personal grav speaker, "you have done well. The Council has been concerned. Your actions have presented unprecedented challenges to the established order." He turned to face the assembled enforcers, his expression hardening. Let this be a lesson. This city, this district, will be brought under the direct control of the Vance Astra Group. All dissenting elements will be neutralized. Arthur remained standing, his hand resting lightly on Naomi's arm. He looked at her, a subtle smile playing on his lips. "I don't need your help to manage your control," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "I don't need anyone's control. The world, Naomi, is a symphony of gravity, and I intend to learn how to play it." He then turned his full attention to his father, a new resolve hardening his gaze. "And I intend to play it my way." Chapter 5. Echoes of the Singularity. The immediate aftermath of the Gala of the High Corps was a cacophony of bewildered whispers and frantic calculations. The Vance Astra's sudden intervention, coupled with Arthur's utterly baffling display of power, had sent shockwaves through the orbital conglomerate. Grand Director Silas Vance, a man accustomed to absolute authority gleaned from decades of strategic maneuvering and ruthless corporate acquisitions, was visibly unnerved. His carefully constructed image, that of the unshakable pillar of the Astra Group, was crumbling under the weight of a gravity master disguised as a scrap hauler. Silas, flanked by a contingent of heavily armored enforcers, initiated a series of interrogations, focused less on Arthur's capabilities and more on his motives. "Why this charade, Arthur?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the reinforced control room of the flagship dreadnought, the Leviathan. "Why spend your days amongst the refuse when you possess the power to reshape reality? Were you seeking to disrupt our operations? To destabilize the market? Or simply to amuse yourself?" Arthur remained disconcertingly calm, answering Silas' probing questions with carefully measured responses. "I was seeking perspective, Father," he replied, his tone devoid of accusation or defensiveness. "Perspective on the structures we build, the power we wield, and the consequences of wielding it without understanding. The Astra Group's success is built upon gravity, a force we manipulate with arrogant precision. I simply wish to experience it in its purest, most fundamental form." The enforcers, a blend of cybernetically enhanced soldiers and genetically modified warriors, shifted uneasily. They'd witnessed firsthand the devastation Arthur had wrought, the way Head weaponized gravity with surgical grace. The reports trickled in, every detail meticulously recorded, every fluctuation in the surrounding gravitational field analyzed. The initial assessment was chilling Arthur. Wasn't merely controlling gravity, he was resonating with it, as if he were an extension of the very fabric of space-time. Silas, however, wasn't convinced. He saw Arthur's behavior as a deliberate provocation, a calculated gamble. "Your actions have exposed a critical vulnerability within our security protocols," Silas declared, slamming his fist on the console, causing the holographic projections of the foundry city to flicker violently. "We will implement a Level 5 lockdown, complete isolation of the foundry district. All personnel, including Ms. Naomi, will be placed under immediate surveillance. And we will begin a systematic dismantling of the density pulse techniques, a dangerous, unpredictable force for the safety of our operations." Meanwhile, Arthur, with Naomi by his side, quietly began his own investigation. They moved through the foundry district with a deliberate calmness, observing the enforcers' movements, analyzing their technology, and noting the subtle shifts in the gravitational grid. Naomi, surprisingly adept at navigating the complex logistics of the foundry, identified patterns in the city's energy consumption, discovering a series of hidden conduits channeling power directly to a secret research facility beneath the Kraken's maw, the district's deepest smelting vat. "They're not just studying density pulse," Naomi murmured, examining a diagnostic readout. "They're trying to copy it." Arthur simply nodded, his eyes narrowed. "Precisely. Someone within the Astra Group recognizes the potential of the density pulse, and they intend to weaponize it." As they approached the Kraken's maw, a squad of enforcers, led by a hulking cyborg named Rexus, intercepted them. Rexus, equipped with a kinetic disruptor, capable of generating localized gravitational distortions, sneered. A scrap boy and a mechanic. What business do you have here? Arthur didn't respond with force. Instead, he subtly adjusted the artificial gravity grid around them, intensifying the pressure tenfold. Rexus, accustomed to operating within a standardized gravitational environment, staggered, his movements becoming erratic. You're playing with forces you don't understand. Rexus roared, attempting to regain control, but Arthur raised a hand, and a miniature, rotating vortex of debris materialized around the cyborg, pinning him within a perfect sphere of distorted gravity. It's not about understanding, Rexus, Arthur said, his voice low and measured. It's about control. And this city, this district, is about to learn that lesson. As they left the Kraken's maw, a low hum filled the air, the unmistakable sound of a squadron of Vance Astra's advanced reconnaissance drones approaching. Silas Vance, watching the unfolding events on the holographic display, allowed a flicker of something akin to apprehension to cross his face. He hadn't anticipated this level of resistance, this unsettling mastery. He realized, with growing dread, that Arthur Vance was not merely a rebellious heir, he was a force of nature, a gravity master, poised to shatter the foundations of the Astra Group, and perhaps reshape the very future of the orbital world. Chapter 6. Echoes in the void, the initial euphoria of the crackdown quickly morphed into a simmering unease within the district. The swift and absolute dismantling of the Kraken security forces, coupled with the spectacle of Kraven and Malik reduced to automatons hauling sludge, was undeniably impressive. But it wasn't the execution that unsettled the inhabitants of the Kraken's maw. It was the how. The efficiency was unsettlingly perfect. Naomi, now a figure of both awe and bewildered concern, found herself constantly observing Arthur. He moved with a quiet grace, an almost unsettling stillness, as he oversaw the restructuring of the district. The initial chaos of the G-drop had been meticulously contained, not just by the restoration of the gravity grid, but by a series of subtle gravitational manipulations, a slight dampening of tremors, a localized shift in weight distribution that prevented further structural damage, a carefully orchestrated fall of debris to guide the workers to safety. It was as if he was conducting a symphony of weight, a performance of control so precise it bordered on the uncanny. He doesn't fight, muttered Jan, a grizzled veteran of the defunct Kraken security, now tasked with supervising Arthur's workforce. He shapes the world. It's unnatural. John, a man who'd spent his life relying on brute force and tactical positioning, couldn't grasp the nuance of Arthur's power. He continued to bark orders, attempting to impose a semblance of order, but his directives were routinely ignored as Arthur subtly adjusted the environment around them. Meanwhile, Silas Vance aboard the flagship Celestial Dawn was growing increasingly agitated. The holographic displays pulsed with constant updates, surveillance footage of the Kraken's maw, analysis of Arthur's gravitational signatures, and increasingly frantic communications from the orbital defense grid. Silas, a man who prided himself on meticulous planning and calculated risk, was grappling with a variable he hadn't accounted for: a raw, intuitive understanding of gravity itself. His core signature is shifting, reported Commander Lyra, her voice tight with concern. It's not just the density pulse, it's adaptive. His learning, evolving daring. The simulations show his, not merely manipulating existing gravity fields, has creating localized distortions, almost resonating with them. Silas slammed his fist on the console, the holographic display flickering momentarily. Damn it, Lyra. I authorized a full spectrum scan. What did we miss? The subtle changes in the ambient gravitational field, Lyra replied. They're almost imperceptible, but they're there, as creating echo effects bouncing off the existing infrastructure. It's like his speaking to the planet itself. Arthur, meanwhile, had moved on to a more strategic objective, investigating the source of the sabotage. Had begun a meticulous examination of the central terminal, using his ability to analyze the flow of energy, not just electrical, but gravitational, that governed the city's stability. He discovered a complex network of microgravitational relays hidden within the terminal's core, designed to provide a redundant layer of control in the event of a primary system failure. But something had been deliberately altered, a tiny fracture in the field that allowed a focused surge of energy to disrupt the stability. As he meticulously traced the distortion, he sensed a familiar presence, a residual gravitational signature, faint but undeniably there. It wasn't Kraven or Malik. It was someone else. Someone who understood the principles of density pulse. "Interesting," Arthur murmured, his eyes focused on a faint shimmer in the air above the terminal. He reached out a hand, not to attack, but to listen. He gently amplified the residual signature, layering it over his own gravitational field. The world around him seemed to shift, the metallic tang of the foundry overlaid with a deeper, more ancient resonance. Suddenly, a voice, cold and precise, echoed in his mind. "You're playing with forces you can't comprehend, Vance. You're a fool." Arthur didn't turn. He simply closed his eyes, focusing his energy. He pinpointed the source of the voice, a hidden control panel concealed within a deactivated exoskeletal repair bay, linked directly to the city's gravitational grid. A young man, barely 20, stared at him with wide, terrified eyes. This was Elias Thorne, a former engineering apprentice for the Vance Astra Group, dismissed for insubordination and radical theories about manipulating gravity. "Why?" Arthur asked, his voice deceptively calm. Elias spat on the floor. "Because this isn't a city, it's a prison. You build your empires on lies and oppression, and were meant to be slaves to your weight." Before Arthur could react, Elias activated a miniature gravity disruptor, aiming it directly at Arthur. The effect was immediate, a jarring disruption in the surrounding gravitational field. Arthur staggered, momentarily disoriented. But then, with a subtle shift in his posture, he simply raised his hand. A miniature, rotating sphere of debris coalesced around Elias, pinning him within a perfect, inescapable prison of distorted gravity. "You thought you could challenge me?" Arthur said, his voice laced with quiet amusement. "You were just an echo, a ripple in the void. And now, you will become a lesson." Chapter 7. The Weight of Revelation. The metallic tang of the foundry intensified, overlaid with a deeper, more ancient resonance, as Arthur, still reeling from Elias' attack, meticulously dismantled the miniature disruptor. The precision of his movements was unsettling, a stark contrast to the clumsy hauling he had been performing for the last 6 months. Each circuit severed, each crystal stabilized, felt like a deliberate unraveling of a carefully constructed deception. Naomi watched, a mixture of awe and unease etched on her face. She'd seen glimpses of this power, the impossible balance, the frozen footsteps, but never witnessed it so consciously, so deliberately deployed. "You're playing with forces you can't comprehend, Vance?" A cold, precise voice echoed in his mind, a persistent irritant that seemed to emanate from the very metal of the city. "You're a fool." Arthur didn't turn. He simply closed his eyes, focusing his energy. He pinpointed the source of the voice, a hidden control panel concealed within a deactivated exoskeletal repair bay, linked directly to the city's gravitational grid. A young man, barely 20, stared at him with wide, terrified eyes. This was Elias Thorne, a former engineering apprentice for the Vance Astra Group, dismissed for insubordination and radical theories about manipulating gravity. "Why?" Arthur asked, his voice deceptively calm. Elias spat on the floor. "Because this isn't a city, it's a prison. You build your empires on lies and oppression, and were meant to be slaves to your weight." Before Arthur could react, Elias activated a miniature gravity disruptor, aiming it directly at Arthur. The effect was immediate, a jarring disruption in the surrounding gravitational field. Arthur staggered, momentarily disoriented. But then, with a subtle shift in his posture, he simply raised his hand. A miniature, rotating sphere of debris coalesced around Elias, pinning him within a perfect, inescapable prison of distorted gravity. "You thought you could challenge me?" Arthur said, his voice laced with quiet amusement. "You were just an echo, a ripple in the void. And now, you'll become a lesson." The sphere tightened, compressing Elias' body, subtly increasing the local gravitational pull. His breath hitched, his eyes widened further, and a thin sheen of sweat coated his forehead. It wasn't brutal, not yet. It was a demonstration, a chilling display of Arthur's control. Naomi instinctively rushed forward, extending a pair of modified hydraulic clamps designed to gently lift and stabilize broken exoskeletons. "Wait!" she shouted, her voice surprisingly firm. Don't escalate it." Arthur paused, the sphere remaining a terrifying testament to his power. He turned to her, a flicker of something akin to sadness in his eyes. "You see, Naomi," he said, his voice low, "this isn't about control. It's about balance. I'm not trying to imprison you. I'm simply correcting a distortion." He extended his hand, not towards Elias, but towards the floor. The sphere of debris shimmered, hesitated, and then, with agonizing slowness, began to unravel. Elias, screaming in a muffled, distorted voice, was released from his prison, collapsing onto the oily concrete, gasping for air. "You misunderstand," Arthur continued, addressing Elias, who was slowly regaining his composure. "This city wasn't built on oppression. It was built on necessity. Without gravity stabilization, this sector would be lost to the sea. You call it a prison? I call it survival." He turned his attention back to Naomi. "But you're right, of course," he added, a faint smile playing on his lips. "The truth is far more complex and far more dangerous than either of us realize." He took a deliberate step forward, and a localized, almost imperceptible shift in the gravity field pressed down on Naomi. It was barely noticeable, a fraction of a degree of added weight, but it was enough to confirm her deepest suspicions. Arthur wasn't just a scrap hauler. He was something far more profound, a living embodiment of the fundamental forces of the universe. As he finished speaking, a rhythmic tapping echoed from the control panel. Elias, recovered enough to speak, scrambled towards the panel, frantically inputting commands. The miniature disruptor, still functional, emitted a high-pitched whine, attempting to re-establish its connection to the grid. But it was too late. Arthur raised his hand, and the sound intensified. The room seemed to constrict, the air thickening with an almost tangible pressure. The miniature disruptor, now radiating a crimson glow, began to violently shake, its components fusing together, becoming an integrated extension of Arthur's own will. "You have resisted," Arthur said, his voice now resonant with power. "But resistance is futile. Let me show you what I can do." He focused his energy, and the debris surrounding them began to swirl with increasing speed, forming a complex, three-dimensional vortex. Suddenly, the entire foundry seemed to become a stage, a carefully orchestrated tableau of manipulated gravity. The walls shimmered, the metal groaned, and for a fleeting moment, it appeared as if the very fabric of reality was bending to Arthur's will. Naomi stared in stunned silence, finally understanding the horrifying truth. Arthur wasn't just wielding a secret power, he was the power. Chapter 8. The Echo of Creation. The crimson glow of the fused disruptor pulsed with Arthur's energy, casting dancing shadows across the grime-streaked walls of the foundry. The vortex of debris hadn't diminished, it had intensified, growing into a localized maelstrom of twisted steel, pulverized ore, and shimmering dust. The air crackled with the palpable force of manipulated gravity, a tangible echo of creation itself. Naomi, still rooted to the spot, felt a primal fear clawing at her, a recognition of something ancient and utterly terrifying. "It's not destruction," Arthur said, his voice now a low, modulated hum, seemingly generated by the vortex itself. "It's balance. This foundry, this entire sector, it's been built on a fundamental imbalance. The Vance Astra Group, with their obsession with artificial stability, have disrupted the natural flow, creating pressure points, vulnerabilities. This is a corrective measure." He took a step forward, and the vortex responded, the swirling debris shifting around him like a responsive shield. He raised his hand, and the density of the air within the vortex increased exponentially. A single, loose rivet, spinning wildly within the maelstrom, suddenly became impossibly heavy, slamming into the concrete floor with a deafening clang, a miniature earthquake contained within a 10-foot radius. "The core principle of density pulse," he explained, his eyes fixed on the vibrating rivet, "isn't just about manipulating mass. It's about understanding the relationships between mass and space. It's about acknowledging that every force, every weight, has a corresponding counterforce." Suddenly, a metallic shriek cut through the chaotic hum. Warden Kraven, along with a contingent of his remaining enforcers, veterans scarred by the gallus devastation, burst into the foundry, weapons raised. They'd been alerted by a frantic comms operator, piecing together the catastrophic events and recognizing the immediate threat. "Hold him!" Kraven bellowed, his face a mask of furious determination. "Disable him. Has a weapon." The enforcers surged forward, firing pulse rifles that spat streams of energy. But the energy dissipated harmlessly against Arthur's shimmering field, the vortex absorbing the blasts and redirecting the force as concentrated bursts of gravity. One of the rifles discharged a particularly powerful pulse, aimed directly at Arthur's chest. But instead of impacting him, the energy was drawn into the vortex, accelerating the swirling debris to an almost unbearable speed. "You misunderstand," Arthur said, his voice laced with weary amusement. "This isn't a battle. It's an experiment." He extended his hand, not to attack, but to reach into the vortex. As his fingers entered the swirling chaos, the intensity of the gravity field rose dramatically. The entire foundry groaned under the strain, metal stretching and bending in impossible ways. Naomi watched in horrified fascination as a partially melted steel beam, hundreds of tons in weight, was drawn into the vortex, instantaneously reforming itself into a perfectly smooth, polished sphere. "I'm reshaping reality," Arthur stated, his voice resonating with a profound sense of power. "Not by destroying it, but by aligning it with its intended form." Kraven, witnessing this display of impossible power, staggered back, his arrogance replaced with genuine terror. "What are you doing?" "I'm demonstrating the consequences of imbalance," Arthur replied, and with a flick of his wrist, the sphere of steel shattered, not violently, but gently, its reformed structure collapsing back into a pile of perfectly organized shards. He then subtly manipulated the gravity within the foundry, shifting the weight of the supporting beams, causing several of Kraven's enforcers to stumble and lose their footing. As the last enforcer fell, Arthur paused, drawing his hand back from the vortex. The crimson glow of the fused disruptors subsided, reverting to a steady, pulsating light, integrated into his own form. The swirling debris within the foundry gradually settled, leaving a thin layer of iridescent dust in its wake. "It's over," he said, his voice returning to its normal timbre. "The foundation of this sector has shifted. The forces that control it now understand the truth." He turned to Naomi, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "You witnessed something extraordinary today, Naomi. Something that will change the world." Before she could respond, a deep voice echoed from the doorway. Grand Director Vance, flanked by a squadron of heavily armored Astra security teams. He surveyed the scene, his expression a carefully constructed mask of controlled concern. "Arthur," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a corporate empire. "I appreciate your demonstration. However, the situation requires a more controlled response. We are initiating a full-scale investigation into the sabotage at the gala. And, naturally, we will be examining your unique abilities." He paused, his eyes scanning Arthur with a calculating gaze. "I trust you understand the importance of discretion, Heir. The world is not ready for the sovereign of weight." Arthur simply nodded, a subtle, knowing smile playing on his lips. The victory was not complete, not yet. But he had planted a seed of understanding, a first step in dismantling the oppressive weight of the Vance Astra Group, and the revelation, though terrifying, had finally connected him to something far grander than had ever imagined. Chapter 9. The Echo of the Singularity. The following days were a carefully orchestrated dance of surveillance and veiled threats. Grand Director Vance's arrival hadn't simply been a dramatic return. It was a surgical strike, a tightening of the noose around Arthur's hidden existence. The Astra security teams, sleek chrome and lethal efficiency, were a constant presence, their sensors subtly scanning the foundry city of Viridium, seeking to catalog and neutralize any potential threat. Naomi, now operating under the watchful eye of a covert Astra unit, found herself constantly reminded of her near-fatal intervention, treated with a mixture of wary respect and thinly disguised apprehension. Arthur, meanwhile, embraced the enforced anonymity, utilizing his scrap-hauling identity with a deliberate awkwardness. He deliberately made a mess of his work, dropping chains, spilling coolant, even managing to trip over his own feet, an act that earned him a particularly icy glare from Warden Kraven, who was now accompanied by a hulking enforcer named Brutus, a man built like a granite boulder. Malik predictably escalated his harassment, relentlessly adjusting the artificial gravity grid around Arthur's workstation, attempting to break him physically and mentally. But Arthur was subtly adapting, honing his control. Each surge of amplified gravity served as an opportunity to deepen his understanding of the density pulse, to refine the boundaries of his power. He began to spend hours alone in the foundry's darkest recesses, practicing not with graceful flowing movements as had learned in the ancient texts, but with brutal, focused bursts. He learned to manipulate the very air around him, creating miniature pockets of intensely concentrated gravity, enough to flatten metal with a touch, to momentarily freeze a falling wrench mid-air. The iridescent dust, a byproduct of his training, grew thicker in these hidden corners, shimmering with an almost tangible energy. One evening, Naomi, drawn by a growing unease, found Arthur meticulously analyzing a fragment of the kinetic hammer's shattered casing. The Astra investigators had meticulously collected the debris, but Arthur was piecing together the weapon's unique construction, mapping the harmonics of the kinetic energy field that had pulsed through the air. "You're studying the weapon's core," she stated, her voice laced with cautious curiosity. Arthur didn't startle. "It's not a weapon in the conventional sense, Naomi. It was a tool, a focused expression of intense force. And it was incredibly fragile in the face of a certain kind of power." He paused, glancing around as if expecting to be overheard. The gala was not simply a malfunction. It was an attempted disruption. Someone was trying to neutralize me. "But why?" Naomi asked, her brow furrowed. "And how could they anticipate the density pulse?" "The pulse isn't merely about manipulating gravity," Arthur explained, his voice low. "It's about understanding its underlying structure, its harmonics. The pulse is a resonance, a vibration. The ancients believed that all matter possesses a vibrational signature, and the density pulse allows you to interact with those signatures. The kinetic hammer, it was designed to disrupt that signature. It was a crude attempt at a countermeasure." Just then, Brutus materialized at the entrance to the workshop, his face impassive. "Director Vance requests your presence, Heir. A private consultation." The consultation took place in a sterile, chrome-lined chamber within the Astra flagship, the Crimson Leviathan. a dreadnought that hung motionless above Viridium, a silent monument to Vance's power. Grand Director Vance, impeccably dressed in a suit of dark gray armor, regarded Arthur with a cold, analytical gaze. "Your demonstration at the gala was remarkable," he admitted, his voice carefully neutral. "It has generated significant interest within the Astra Group. We've been reviewing the data gathered from the kinetic hammer analysis. It seems your interpretation of the attack was accurate, an attempt to disrupt your vibrational resonance." He then revealed a holographic projection, a complex schematic of the kinetic hammer's core, overlaid with intricate waveforms representing the energy field. "We've discovered a secondary hidden function within the device, a targeted harmonic dampener, designed to suppress abilities like yours." Arthur felt a cold dread settle over him. He realized then that they weren't simply studying his abilities, they were actively seeking to understand and replicate them. "You're trying to weaponize the density pulse," he stated, his voice dangerously calm. "Precisely," Vance replied, a flicker of something akin to triumph in his eyes. "We've identified several individuals with similar, latent potential. Individuals who, like you, were unknowingly manipulated by the ancient texts, the remnants of the pre-collapse civilizations. We intend to bring them under our control." He gestured towards a screen displaying images of several individuals, a young engineer in a distant mining colony, a grizzled mechanic in a salvaged freighter, even Naomi, identified by her biometric signature. "You, Heir, are our key. You represent the culmination of that knowledge, and we intend to harness it." As the image of Naomi solidified on the screen, Arthur felt a surge of protectiveness, a primal instinct to shield her from harm. The iridescent dust, clinging to his clothes, seemed to pulse with a renewed intensity, a silent promise of retribution. The fight, he realized, had only just begun. Chapter 10: Echoes of the Fallen. The immediate aftermath of the gala was a swirling vortex of panicked activity. Grand Director Theron Vance, a man sculpted from glacial efficiency and generational privilege, moved with a disconcerting grace, issuing orders that seemed to anticipate every contingency. The orbital dreadnoughts, initially symbols of terrifying power, now functioned as mobile command centers, meticulously coordinating the cleanup operation, a carefully orchestrated display of corporate control, rather than genuine concern. Arthur, however, remained largely untouched. Had spent the hours since the revelation absorbing the chaos, observing the subtle shifts in power dynamics. Had systematically dismantled the holographic projection, erasing the incriminating schematics and biometric data with a focused pulse of gravitational distortion, a maneuver that left the technicians scrambling for explanations, attributing it to a localized system anomaly. He found Naomi in the central control room of the foundry, meticulously calibrating the recalibrated gravity stabilizers. The air still hummed with residual energy, a faint thrumming that resonated deep within his bones, a constant reminder of the raw power he commanded. She was working with a grim focus, her brow furrowed, the faint scent of ozone clinging to her nimble hands. "You're still here," he said, his voice low, a deliberate contrast to the opulent surroundings. Naomi glanced up, a flicker of fatigue in her eyes, but a spark of something else, recognition, perhaps, or a quiet understanding met his gaze. "Someone had to make sure this place didn't collapse on itself. Your father's cleanup is just a PR exercise. They'll quietly reroute the stabilizers, tighten the security, and pretend nothing happened." "Precisely," Arthur confirmed, stepping closer. "Which is why I need to understand the extent of your involvement." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You've been observing me. You've noticed the imbalances." Naomi didn't flinch. "I've noticed that when you step on the floor, it doesn't feel like it's moving beneath your feet. I've noticed the way you can lift a ton of scrap with what looks like nothing but a determined expression." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "And I've noticed that when I try to help you, you seem to anticipate my every move, as if you already know what's going to happen." Suddenly, the lights in the control room flickered violently. The rhythmic pulse of the gravity stabilizers intensified, creating a localized distortion field. Technicians shouted, scrambling to regain control. Before anyone could react, Arthur moved. It wasn't a grand sweeping display of power, but a precise, surgical manipulation of gravity, a subtle alteration of the field around the central console. The flickering ceased. The stabilizers stabilized. "You're learning," Vance observed, stepping into the room. He offered a thin, almost sardonic smile. "Your father was right to invest in your training. The ability to manipulate gravity isn't merely a weapon, it's a foundational understanding of the universe itself. And you intend to weaponize that understanding," Arthur countered, his voice laced with steel. "You're not interested in stabilizing cities, Director. You're interested in control. Control is the bedrock of civilization," Vance replied, his composure unwavering. "Without it, there is only chaos. We've simply chosen a more efficient method of achieving it." He gestured to a newly arrived team of operatives, clad in sleek black armor, each equipped with handheld gravity emitters. "These devices, developed based on your own unique abilities, will allow us to identify and neutralize potential threats, individuals like yourself, who represent a deviation from the established order." Arthur's eyes scanned the operatives, a network of subtly shifting gravitational fields around him, forming a protective cocoon. He recognized the technology, a derivative of the density pulse, but refined and weaponized, capable of delivering a concentrated burst of gravitational force. "You believe you can simply eradicate anyone who possesses this potential?" "We aim to guide it," Vance corrected, his voice hardening. "Your father and I have spent decades piecing together the lost knowledge of the pre-collapse civilizations. We know how to harness this power, to shape it to our will, and we will not hesitate to eliminate anyone who stands in our way." Suddenly, a sharp, high-pitched whine filled the room. The gravity emitters activated, targeting Arthur with beams of concentrated gravitational force. He reacted instinctively, enveloping himself in a localized zone of null gravity, effectively nullifying the emitter's effect. The operatives stumbled, disoriented, struggling to regain their footing. As the room descended into momentary chaos, a single crimson thread of energy detached itself from Arthur's wrist, a faint pulse of the density pulse, consciously manipulated, not as a weapon, but as a communication. He focused the pulse, sending a complex sequence of data directly to Naomi's augmented implants. "They're tracking you, Naomi," he whispered urgently. "And they're preparing a full-scale engagement. You need to get out of here. Now, Dao." Naomi understood instantly. The red thread vanished, and she turned, moving with a speed that belied her worn appearance. "I told you this would happen," she said, already heading for the emergency exit, a determined glint in her eyes. As she disappeared into the labyrinthine corridors of the foundry, Arthur knew one thing: the reckoning had truly begun, and he was facing not just a corporate empire, but a legacy of manipulation, a battle for the very soul of gravity itself. Chapter 11. The echo of stone, the air in the foundry's lower levels, was thick with the smell of burnt metal and desperation. Naomi, guided by the fragmented data stream Arthur had transmitted, navigated the maze of support beams and deactivated machinery with a practiced efficiency that bordered on unsettling. The red pulse had vanished, leaving behind a subtle, vibrating pressure in her skull, Arthur's signature. She adjusted the filters in her augmented vision, amplifying the structural stress patterns of the building, a habit shed developed during her time patching together crippled exoskeletons. The Vance Astra dreadnoughts, initially a terrifying spectacle, were now a constant, ominous presence overhead, their golden hulls glinting through the perpetual twilight of the foundry. Kraven's forces, bolstered by a contingent of elite stabilizers, heavily armored units equipped with miniature gravity emitters, were systematically clearing the lower sectors, their movements precise and brutal. Malik, predictably, was leading the charge, a smug, arrogant figure in a customized combat harness. His voice crackling over the comms, barking orders and gloating about his impending victory. "Find him! Crush him like the scrap he thinks he is," Malik shrieked, his words laced with a chilling contempt. Naomi's destination was the abandoned ventilation shaft system, a relic of a bygone era of haphazard construction. Arthur had used it as a temporary haven during his initial acclimation, a place to hone his skills without drawing attention. It was a precarious space, filled with crumbling concrete and the ghosts of dust-laden air, but it provided a crucial layer of concealment. As she rounded a particularly tight bend, she found him. Arthur was seated on a salvaged girder, meticulously polishing a small, intricately carved jade pendant, a piece head apparently acquired from a black market dealer. The pendant, she recognized, was a stone echo, a device designed to amplify and focus gravitational fluctuations. He was radiating a barely perceptible field of localized density, a subtle shield against detection. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and calm, barely audible above the rhythmic clang of Kraven's forces. He didn't look up, continuing to meticulously polish the pendant. "They're closing in," Naomi replied, her hand resting on the articulated wrench strapped to her thigh. "I detected a shift in the stabilizer deployment. They've realized you're not just a scrap hauler." Arthur finally looked up. His eyes, usually obscured by a weary skepticism, held a sharp, assessing gaze. "They are beginning to understand," he observed, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "A shame they require such brute force to comprehend." Suddenly, the ventilation shaft shuddered violently. A stabilizer, a hulking figure encased in gray combat armor, slammed into the wall beside them, its gravity emitter spitting out a concentrated beam. Arthur didn't flinch. With a single, fluid movement, he raised his hand, and the beam dissipated, collapsing harmlessly into the steel floor. "Impressive, even for a scavenger," Malik's voice dripped with sarcasm over the comms. "Let's see if your skills can protect you from a direct assault." Before Naomi could react, the stabilizer launched itself at Arthur, its weapon targeting his midsection. Arthur, however, didn't dodge. He simply shifted his weight, subtly manipulating the gravitational field around him. The stabilizer slammed into him, but instead of impacting with force, it bounced off, propelled backward with amplified momentum. The stabilizer went sprawling, crashing into a stack of collapsed girders, a tangle of sparking metal and twisted armor. The singularity state, Naomi realized, understanding the silent, terrifying power Arthur wielded. He hadn't used it offensively, not yet, but had demonstrated its potential with chilling efficiency. "It's a delicate dance," Arthur said, breathing heavily. "Too much force, and you break yourself. Too little, and you're merely another casualty." He extended his hand, and a shimmering, almost translucent dome of compressed gravity enveloped them, shielding them from the remaining stabilizers. The air within the dome shimmered, distorted by the localized gravitational waves. "I'm not a warrior, Naomi," Arthur said, his voice laced with an unexpected vulnerability. "I'm a repairman. I fix what's broken. And right now, this world is catastrophically broken." He turned his attention to the jade pendant, holding it up to the faint light. "This," he said, his voice gaining a quiet intensity, "is a reminder. The density pulse isn't about destruction. It's about balance. It's about understanding the fundamental forces at play, the constant push and pull of weight, of mass, of gravity itself. It is a key to preventing collapse, to constructing a future where weight is not a burden, but a foundation." As he spoke, the pendant pulsed with a soft crimson light, and the air around them thrummed with an almost palpable energy. A single, perfectly formed droplet of water, suspended in mid-air, began to rotate, slowly, exquisitely, drawing in the ambient light and creating a miniature vortex, a visible manifestation of the density pulse. Kraven intends to use this technology to solidify his power, to crush dissent, Arthur continued, his gaze fixed on the pulsating pendant. I intend to use it to build something enduring. Chapter 12. The Echo of Stone. The crimson glow of the jade pendant had become Arthur's constant companion, a subtle, unsettling heartbeat in the grimy foundry city. Naomi, initially wary, now approached him with a quiet respect, meticulously documenting the changes he wrought with the density pulse. The rhythmic shifts in gravity, once terrifyingly chaotic, were now being harnessed, stabilizing the crumbling foundation of the lower sector, reinforcing the worn metal of the exoskeletons, even subtly influencing the flow of molten steel within the vats, reducing waste and increasing efficiency. Kraven and Malik, meanwhile, were a spectacle of self-inflicted misery. Strapped into their hulking iron suits, their movements were slow, agonizingly deliberate as they dragged themselves through the thick, clinging mud, their faces perpetually slick with sweat and shame. The automated dampeners built into the suits did little to mitigate the immense pressure, and the constant physical exertion was slowly, irrevocably reshaping them. Their shoulders slumped, their movements jerky, a permanent expression of weary servitude etched onto their features. "They're almost beautiful," Arthur commented one evening, as Naomi meticulously calibrated a new density field to reinforce the structural integrity of a collapsed support beam. The air around the beam shimmered, the rust-colored metal taking on a strange, almost crystalline sheen. In a profoundly unpleasant way, of course. Naomi, covered in soot and grease, offered a dry smile. "You have a morbid fascination with suffering, Vance." "It's not suffering, Naomi," Arthur corrected, carefully adjusting the energy flow. "It's potential. They represent the raw material of this world, the stubborn refusal to yield. I'm not punishing them, I'm calibrating them, ensuring they understand the true weight of their actions." The gala of the High Core, a week later, was a thinly veiled showcase of Vance Astra's dominance. The orbital conglomerate had rebranded its presence in the foundry city, presenting itself not as a ruthless corporation, but as a benevolent provider, offering stability solutions and gravitational harmony. Grand Director Silas Vance, Arthur's father, was the primary speaker, delivering a speech filled with platitudes about progress and shared prosperity, punctuated by carefully orchestrated demonstrations of G-Core technology luxury, levitating apartments, and opulent transport systems, a stark contrast to the grim reality of the lower sector. Arthur, however, remained an observer, a silent, almost ghostly figure amidst the glittering throng. He wore a simple dark gray work tunic, the faint shimmer of the density pulse subtly distorting the air around him. He moved with a quiet grace that seemed utterly incongruous with the opulent surroundings, a stark reminder of his past life. Malik, fueled by resentment and a desperate need to prove himself, saw an opportunity. During a brief, deliberately chaotic demonstration, a controlled gravitational surge, designed to impress Malik, initiated a sequence that bypassed the emergency override systems, deliberately destabilizing the core stabilizer directly above the slums. The familiar lurch of the G-drop began, buildings tilting precariously, the air thick with dust, and the screams of panicked citizens. Naomi, working frantically at the central terminal, attempted to manually engage the safety clamps, but Malik, using a crude electromagnetic pulse generator, short-circuited the system, plunging her into darkness. "You'll pay for that, scrap boy," Malik roared, raising the kinetic hammer, its energy cells already humming with destructive potential. This time, Arthur didn't hesitate. He dropped his hauling chains, the movement fluid and precise, a subtle shift in the very fabric of reality. The tremors ceased. The distorted building settled. Malik's hammer, mid-swing, froze in mid-air, its trajectory subtly altered by the unseen force. The effect wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a wholesale destruction. It was a controlled manipulation, a delicate dance with gravity itself. A pressure gradient, a localized intensification of the density pulse, enough to incapacitate Malik, enough to demonstrate the devastating potential of his arrogance. As Malik struggled against the sudden, unbearable weight, Arthur turned to Naomi, his expression unreadable. "It's not about power, Naomi," he said, his voice barely audible above the chaos. "It's about control, about understanding the limits of your own strength." He extended his hand, not to directly attack, but to touch the ground beneath Malik's feet. A perfect, shimmering dome of compressed gravity enveloped the entire area, encompassing the struggling enforcer and the falling debris. The air within the dome warped, reflecting the distorted image of the city, a miniature, unstable universe contained within a bubble of controlled force. "This," he said, his gaze fixed on the swirling vortex, "is a lesson. A reminder that even the most powerful can be brought to their knees by a simple understanding of the world around them." Chapter 13. Echoes of the Void. The rain hadn't stopped. It hammered against the corrugated iron roofs of the foundry sector, a relentless, greasy deluge that mirrored the churn in Arthur's stomach. The aftermath of the Gala of the High Core was a scene of stunned disbelief and simmering rage. The Vance Astra fleet, a shimmering armada of gold and obsidian, dominated the skyline, a stark reminder of the power that had just been casually wielded. Grand Director Silas Vance, a man sculpted from ice and expectation, regarded the devastation with a glacial politeness, his presence more a threat than a gesture of reconciliation. Arthur, meanwhile, was meticulously sorting through the wreckage, not with a sense of triumph, but with a quiet, almost sorrowful focus. He wasn't interested in the immediate restitution, the promises of rebuilding, or the accolades being showered upon him. He was studying the distortion, the echo of the density pulse had unleashed. The city itself seemed to hum with residual gravitational stress, a phantom weight that tugged subtly at the edges of reality. Naomi, drenched and dusted with steel grit, approached him, her face etched with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "They're saying it was a calibration anomaly, Arthur," she said, her voice tight. "A localized gravitational surge during a system diagnostic. They're blaming it on faulty stabilizers." Arthur didn't respond immediately. He was circling the flattened remains of the central terminal, his bare feet moving with an unnerving grace, as if he was navigating a river of solidified spacetime. "Calibration anomalies don't shatter steel, Naomi," he finally said, his voice low, almost meditative. "And they certainly don't raise men to the sky like so much refuse." He picked up a small, intricately carved gear, one of the components had salvaged from a damaged exoskeleton. He held it up to the light, rotating it slowly, examining the precise interlocking of its teeth. "The density pulse isn't just about brute force, Naomi. It's about understanding the fundamental forces at play. It's about resonance." Suddenly, his hand tightened, and the gear began to spin faster, defying gravity. It levitated a few inches above his palm, rotating with increasing velocity, creating a miniature vortex of swirling metal particles. Naomi gasped, stepping back instinctively. "Don't be afraid," Arthur said, his voice calm, reassuring. "This is a brief amplification. A demonstration." He focused, and the spinning gear began to increase in density, subtly thickening, becoming heavier, drawing in stray particles of dust and debris. "It's a contained singularity, Naomi," he explained, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "A tiny echo of the power I can command. I'm not simply manipulating gravity, I'm interacting with its inherent potential, its vibrational signature." Just then, a harsh, metallic voice cut through the rain. "Vance, you dare demonstrate your abilities before the Grand Director?" It was Warden Kraven, flanked by two heavily armored enforcers. His face was contorted with barely suppressed fury. Malik, his son, stood beside him, a sneer twisting his lips. "You've become quite the spectacle, haven't you?" Kraven sneered. "A scrap hauler with a penchant for chaos. A disgrace to your family's legacy." He gestured to his enforcers. "Secure him. We'll have a thorough investigation into this calibration anomaly." Arthur remained motionless, his eyes fixed on Kraven. He didn't attempt to flee, didn't raise a hand in defiance. He simply continued to manipulate the gear, slowly intensifying the localized gravity around it, until the tiny vortex threatened to overwhelm the surrounding space. Then, without warning, the gear stopped spinning. It dropped back into his hand, now radiating a faint, pulsing warmth. Arthur raised his hand, and a shimmering dome, smaller than the one Head created at the gala, enveloped Kraven. It wasn't a crushing force, but an intensely focused pressure enough to make the warden stagger, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You misunderstand, Warden," Arthur said, his voice amplified slightly by the dome, carrying a chilling resonance. "I don't seek to destroy. I seek to understand. And I understand that your arrogance is a far greater threat than any force I could wield." As the dome dissipated, leaving Kraven visibly shaken, a new figure stepped forward, Director Silas Vance. "Arthur," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "this display is unsettling. However, it confirms what I suspected. Your abilities are not merely a quirk of lineage. They are substantial." He turned to Malik. "Secure this man. Transport him to the obsidian vault. We will study him. We will learn to control this power." Arthur didn't resist. He simply nodded, the rain washing over him, the weight of the world, and the potential of his own power, pressing down on him with an unbearable intensity. He knew this was just the beginning. The echoes of the void he had briefly unleashed were already spreading, a silent promise of a reckoning yet to come. Chapter 14. The Weight of Knowledge. The obsidian vault was less a building, and more a wound in the earth, a colossal, perfectly smooth cylinder of black unknown alloy, carved into the side of Mount Cinder, the volcano that birthed the Foundry City. The air within thrummed with a low, almost subsonic hum, and the scent was of static and something ancient, like turned stone and distant storms. Director Vance, a man sculpted from expensive restraint and a perpetual frown, moved with unsettling efficiency, flanked by a squad of chrome-plated enforcers, their faces obscured by polarized visors. Arthur, still coated in a fine layer of dust and grime, felt acutely out of place amidst the sterile perfection. Malik, predictably, was a spectacle. Strapped into a ludicrously bulky, articulated iron mining suit, he resembled a lumbering, enraged beetle. The suit's internal sensors screamed with the forced density readings, a staggering 4.5 times planetary gravity. He raged against his restraints, kicking and thrashing, the suit groaning under the immense pressure. "You'll regret this, Vance boy," he shrieked, his voice distorted by the suit's comms. "You think you control gravity? I was born with it. This is a perversion." Silas Vance, a man of precise angles and colder blue eyes, remained unmoved. "Silence, Malik. Your continued defiance only confirms our suspicions. Arthur, your assessment of the situation was astute. The G-drop was a deliberate act, a crude demonstration of power. And you, my boy, demonstrated a mastery of that power that surpasses anything I've ever encountered." He gestured towards a complex array of holographic projections that shimmered around a central observation platform. "We've been running simulations based on your initial display at the gala. The singularity state the ability to induce localized gravitational distortions with such precision and force is unprecedented." Arthur remained silent, observing the technicians meticulously scanning him with an array of instruments that buzzed and pulsed with an eerie light. One, a slender woman named Lyra with perpetually ink-stained fingers, approached him cautiously. "The biosignatures are extraordinary," Heir Vance, she said, her voice hushed. Your neural pathways exhibit a level of spatial awareness that suggests a fundamental connection to gravitational fields. It's as if your very consciousness is attuned to the ebb and flow of mass. It's not a connection, Arthur said, his voice measured. It's a skill, honed over years of disciplined training. The density pulse isn't a gift, it's a responsibility. Vance cut him off with a wave of his hand. Responsibility is precisely what we intend to foster, Arthur. We've been studying the Vance family lineage for centuries, searching for traces of this power. It's been dormant until you awakened it. He turned to Malik, who was now slumped against the suit, breathing heavily, his face contorted with pain. Release him. The enforcers efficiently neutralized Malik, disconnecting the suit's power and easing him into a reinforced transport chair. As they wheeled him out, Malik glared at Arthur with venomous hatred. You'll pay for this, Vance. You'll regret unleashing this power on the world. Once Malik was gone, the atmosphere in the vault shifted. Vance turned his full attention to Arthur. We've isolated specific neural patterns associated with your ability, Lyra explained, pointing to a holographic representation of Arthur's brain. We've identified the key sequences, the rhythmic fluctuations in neural conductivity that trigger the singularity state. We believe we can replicate and control those patterns. Control? Arthur raised an eyebrow. Or merely mimic? Both, perhaps, Vance replied. A subtle flicker of something. Was it ambition? In his eyes, the potential is undeniable. Imagine, Arthur, a weapon capable of manipulating gravity on a battlefield. A shield that renders projectiles harmless. A tool for unparalleled industrial control. The possibilities are staggering. Suddenly, the subsonic hum of the vault intensified, and the holographic projections flickered violently. The air crackled with energy. Arthur felt a familiar, unsettling pressure building within him. A tingling sensation that spread from his feet to the crown of his head. He instinctively braced himself, his muscles tensing, preparing for the surge. What's happening? Lyra cried, frantically adjusting the monitoring equipment. Before anyone could answer, Arthur did something unexpected. He closed his eyes, focused his mind, and extended a single hand towards a small spherical metal ball resting on a nearby workbench. The workshop, previously still, suddenly pulsed with an unseen energy. The metal ball began to rotate, faster and faster, until it was a blur of silver. A miniature vortex, shimmering with gravitational distortion, formed around it. It grew, threatening to overwhelm the workbench, to destabilize the entire chamber. He stopped it with a conscious effort, a subtle readjustment of his focus. The vortex collapsed, the metal ball returning to its resting place. Silence descended once more, heavier this time, laden with a new understanding. Vance stared at Arthur, his expression a mixture of awe and apprehension. It's accelerating, he whispered. Your control is growing, Arthur. You're learning to harness the power before you even understand it. You're becoming something far more than a scrap hauler. Chapter 15. The echo of creation, the subsonic hum of the vault had intensified, a persistent thrumming that vibrated through the very bones of the foundry. Lyra, her face slick with sweat, wrestled with the recalcitrant holographic projections, a tangle of shimmering equations swirling uselessly on the wall. The air crackled, not with electricity this time, but with something older, something intrinsically tied to the deepest secrets of the density pulse. Arthur felt it again, that unsettling pressure, a tingling awareness of forces beyond human comprehension. It's accelerating, Vance breathed, his voice tight with a controlled urgency. He didn't look at Arthur, his gaze fixed on the erratic readings. Your control is growing, Arthur. You're learning to harness the power before you even understand it. You're becoming something far more than a scrap hauler. The scrap hauler was a carefully constructed lie, a role Arthur had embraced with a grim dedication. Had chosen it deliberately, a deliberate shedding of the gilded cage of the Vance Astra Group, a way to remain unnoticed, to cultivate the dormant strength within. But the vault, and now, this was shattering that carefully built fade. Suddenly, Arthur did something unexpected. He closed his eyes, his jaw clenched, and focused his mind, a deliberate, inward-directed action. Extending a single hand towards a small spherical metal ball, a common, crudely manufactured bearing resting on a nearby workbench, the workshop exploded. It wasn't a violent burst, but a controlled, terrifying surge of energy. The metal ball, previously still, began to rotate, a blur of polished steel, gaining impossible speed. Within moments, a miniature vortex, shimmering with iridescent distortions, formed around it, twisting the air like a visible breath. It expanded, consuming the workbench, threatening to engulf the entire chamber in a maelstrom of gravitational flux. Lyra screamed, scrambling to activate the emergency containment field, a shimmering dome designed to contain volatile energy bursts. But it was too late. The vortex, now a swirling column of shimmering gray, reached a critical mass, threatening to rip apart the very fabric of the foundry's reinforced steel. Then, Arthur stopped it, not with a forceful directed action, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible readjustment of his focus. It was like gently easing a turbulent river back into its channel. The vortex collapsed, imploding in on itself with a silent, contained flash of light, the metal ball returning to its resting place as if nothing had happened. Silence descended, heavier now, saturated with an understanding that shifted the very air. The holographic projections, momentarily frozen in chaos, stabilized, displaying a complex schematic of the gravitational grid, overlaid with a pulsing violet energy signature that originated solely from Arthur. Vance approached cautiously, his aged face etched with disbelief. "It's intensifying," he murmured, adjusting a sensor connected to Arthur's wrist. "The feedback loop is stabilizing. You're not just manipulating gravity, Arthur. You're weaving it. You're creating an echo of creation itself." Arthur remained motionless, his eyes closed, a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. He wasn't exhausted, not physically. It was a deeper, more profound fatigue, the strain of pushing against a fundamental law of the universe. "The singularity state," Vance whispered, his voice laced with a mixture of fear and fascination. "You're accessing it consciously, and with increasing proficiency." He pointed to a complex array of dials and gauges on a nearby console. "The readings there off the charts. The fluctuation in your core gravity signature is exponentially increasing. This isn't just density pulse. This is something far more profound, far more ancient." Suddenly, a sharp clang echoed through the foundry. Malik, predictably, had arrived, flanked by two hulking enforcers. "Look what I found, Warden," he shouted, brandishing a damaged gravnet, its intricate wiring sparking intermittently. "Trying to rehabilitate a scrap boy, are you? Perhaps a little extra weight will remind him of his place." Malik activated the local gravity grid, targeting Arthur with a sickening threefold amplification. The effect was immediate. Arthur's face contorted in pain, his body straining against the unnatural force. But this time he didn't flinch, didn't fall. Instead, a faint blue glow emanated from his hands, intensifying as he focused. The air around him shimmered, distorting the light. "Stop, Malik," Vance barked, stepping forward. "You don't understand what you're doing." Before Malik could react, Arthur raised his hand. This time the energy was not contained, not controlled. It erupted outwards in a wave of pure gravitational force, not aimed at Malik, but at the enhanced gravity grid itself. The artificial gravity field, a sophisticated system of pulsating emitters, disintegrated in a shower of sparks and twisted metal, leaving the foundry bathed in an eerie blue light. Malik, stunned, stumbled backward, his face pale with terror. What have you done?" Arthur didn't answer. He simply looked at Naomi, who stood frozen, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and something akin understanding. The air around him pulsed with potential, a silent promise of the devastating power he now possessed. He was no longer a simple scrap hauler. He was a force of nature, an echo of creation, and he had just begun to awaken.